Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Soul School. Class is in session, and here's lesson number one. When you're the producer of a show, the last thing that you should do is try to alienate two of your very favorite hosts by making disparaging remarks about the length of time their very festivus Christmas lights are still up. And who decides when the holiday comes to an end? There he is. There's your culprit right there.
Yep, I'm leaving mine up till June now.
Are you? Well, we considered maybe putting Easter eggs on it and
Yeah.
leaving the bunnies. It's completely covered in little furry creatures. It's
Hmm.
perfect for spring.
Yeah.
Take anything that's, very specifically Christmassy off it and then just put Easter eggs on it and some multicolored lights. We could do that. Or we could, take it down and decorate in other ways. The point is to decorate. And it was supposed to be down last weekend,
Hmm.
but you can't see them all. But this whole room behind me is filled with boxes because we had the house replumbed this
Hmm.
week.
Yeah, I
And,
remember you saying that. Yep.
it's like, think of the thing that could create the most disruption: having your water turned off, having your entire kitchen floor covered with men who are exposing themselves from behind, if you know what I mean. Um, it's, there's just, these guys are so typically plumbers. They are. And they're both smart as whips and great at their job.
Yeah.
But their pants, I don't know what the issue is from behind, if you know what I mean.
I know what you
Um,
mean. You wonder, do you become like that when you become a plumber, or do you have to become like
to
that?
evolve
Yeah, I don't
into
know.
somebody that exposes themselves routinely in strangers' homes. I don't know. I'm not sure. Um, but so let me ask your permission about this, Jeff, because very often
Mhm.
on the show, I'll share with people a little bit of the back and forth that we go through each week to put this show together. And
Yeah.
sometimes I read things that you've sent to me because I perceive them to be so brilliant that it seems unfair not to share them with our friends.
Mhm.
But this one was particularly telling in terms of the content of the show. So do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, yeah.
Remember
I have
what
no
I
problem
wrote?
with you sharing that. No. Yep.
That's not a problem? Okay,
Not at
because
all. Just don't mind my typos and grammatical errors.
oh, I read right over those, darling, right over
Thank you.
them. I do. I do that to my mind too. All right, let me put, because I am old and losing my sight unless I'm looking into the stratosphere, in which case I can see everything. Um, uh, so in response to, I sent you a message Monday as 11:11 just popped up on the 100 clocks or so in this house. I got the warm fuzzies thinking of you because that's kind of our number. And we've
Hmm.
been communicating with numbers recently.
Hmm.
And your response was this: I was literally just about to text you something about the show on Friday when that popped up. Got pulled away for a minute then, but let me know your thoughts on this, which I did, obviously, as we're doing it for the show tonight. Thinking about the concept of liminality, liminal space, the in between, transitional space. So Friday night was clearly a liminal space, the halfway point between the winter solstice, and that was last week's show.
Yep.
The halfway point between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. So we were in between two halves of a whole. That the major manifestation that happened at the farmhouse happened at dusk or dawn, um, or in the liminal space where darkness and light touch noses. Also, 515 equals 515. 5 and 5 are two halves of a whole 10, which the one serving as a marker of liminal space between them. The idea of liminality is etymologically tied to the concept of rites of passage, etc. So transition from childhood to adulthood. Was thinking of your comments that the apparitions would appear in the space between darkness and light, but would disappear when one became the predominant feature. Also, it is always claimed that haunting, etc., often begins occurring when a child, oftentimes a young woman, hits around 13 years of age or is coming into physical maturity. I know this is a lot, but I'm thinking about the fact that liminality also represents balance. And so sometimes when we feel that we are stuck between two things or two seasons of life, the truth is that we may actually be in a state of potential balance. If we realize it as being that and embrace it instead of forcing our way back into one extreme or the other, we will experience the enchanted world that we only really see. Touched my heart when we stand in between two worlds. I thought I could get through it without crying, but it just touched my heart. It resonated with me in such a way that I was sitting over on the sofa reading it, and all of a sudden I reached over and I grabbed a tissue. I started wiping my eyes, and my sister's like, "Who made you cry?" She thought I got a nasty message or something. I'm like, no, this is so beautiful. So beautiful. Do you know how privileged I feel to be one of the people to have, this rarefied relationship with somebody like you where I get texts like this that inspire me during the course of a day and come at precisely the right moment when I need the message the most. And I love you and I thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm honored. And
where are my freaking tissues?
Yeah. I'm honored. Well, before we launch into this, I'm going to shed my Mr. Rogers persona because it's actually pretty warm back here.
I'm pretty hot too, so yeah. I'm going to expose the shoulders and you can all just deal with it because it's pretty hot in here.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's really been on my heart all week. And I felt like last Friday, something pretty significant actually happened. I know it didn't come like with a lot of bombast and pomp and circumstance, but I felt a shift, in me. Yeah. And that happens when we observe and we pay attention to, I think, things like what was going on last Friday night, which traditionally on the Christian calendar anyways is a feast called Candlemas. And we talked about that quite a bit. It's tied to Groundhog Day. If anybody wants to go back and listen to it,
go to the archive. It's a great show
there. But Candlemas, just 30-second recap. Candlemas is essentially 40 days after Advent or Christmas, and it celebrates the purification of the Theotokos, or the Mother of God, Mary, at the temple. And when they enter into the temple, her carrying the Christ, they encounter someone named Simeon and they encounter a woman named Anna. So there's the masculine and feminine principles. They encounter the anima and the animus. And both of these individuals had been there waiting for the Christ to appear. And here he comes. Mary's carrying him. In some of the traditional liturgies, it's compared to the story of Isaiah, where the seraphim, the burning one, as that word means, takes a coal from the altar and cleanses the lips of the prophet Isaiah. Mary is called the seraphim in some of the liturgies, and the Christ is the live coal she's carrying that she touches to the lips of these individuals who were waiting, and they have this sort of mystic burning experience. But they were both in darkness, in a sense, not in an evil way, but they were in darkness in the sense of ignorance, or in the sense of waiting. They were waiting for a light to dawn, and they encounter it when they encounter the Christ. And Simeon even says as much. He calls the Christ a light to the Gentiles. So symbolically, this is meant to be the place where darkness and light touch noses. They're coming in contact with one another. They're pressed up against each other. Neither one or the other is predominant. They're in balance, right? And so
And
last
the
week,
praying position
yeah,
is meant as part of that expression.
yes,
The two hands
absolutely.
coming together as one, facing up.
Yeah, yep.
Yeah.
Yep, as is this symbol is meant to represent
Right.
the joining of halves. Um, um, yeah, so that's what that feast of Candlemas represents, and that's why it's celebrated by blessing and lighting candles, because it's meant to represent the dawning of the light, because it's the halfway point between the winter solstice, which represents darkness, and the spring equinox, which is the return of the light. It's the perfect place of balance between the two. Now, as we were talking about this, we came to the end of the show, and we were talking about the balancing of masculine and feminine energy, and you mentioned about the farmhouse, which obviously you refer to in your book, the title House of Darkness, House of Light. You know, there's that balance right there. But you mentioned the fact that most of the major manifestations, let's say, occurred at dusk or at dawn, the place where the light and the dark, again, they're touching,
Mm-hmm.
and neither one is dominant over the other. There's balance. And then you said when one would become dominant, they would often fade. And you said 5:15 was the time when these would often happen, and they would be so powerful that it would stop the clock, meaning that number is significant.
Yes.
There's something there. And it's just so, I really believe that we live in a world that is constructed mostly of story and symbol, and reality streams to us, and then it passes through the membrane of story. And so reality is streamed to us in such a way it looks like our own history. And so we call that synchronicity. And so that's why there's always these fingerprints of destiny all over things that we can trace throughout our lives. But so that made me think of 515. I was like, well, what's the meaning of that number? And as I said in that text to you, 515, that's two halves of a whole, right? 10, two odd numbers, two halves of a whole, with a one in the middle representing a veil or a space of liminality separating them. 5, 5, and 1. Also, that's 11. 11 represents the start of a new sequence, right? Zero's out at 10, and then it begins again.
And then begins again.
Yeah. So you have the 515, again, a symbol of liminal space. And so I was thinking to myself since the show, I was really thinking about this concept. Now, mythologically, monsters appear at the edge of the world. Ghosts appear at borders.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at an old map of the world, you'll always have the Kraken or the Leviathan or whatever, these monstrous,
kind of peeking over the you know what I'm talking about, curvature, the natural curvature of the earth. Yeah.
So at the edge, these were made because they're meant to be displayed, but also there's something that's going on in the collective unconscious that makes us place monsters at the edge. Okay. So
the periphery. They go to the periphery.
Yep.
The ghosts are among us.
Yes. So monsters appear at the edge. Ghosts appear at borders. So I often think of it like this. If you take a can of paint, you throw it on a wall. You take, let's just say, dark red paint on a white wall, and it just goes all over the place. You have this dense center where everything is red. And you can, if you zoom the camera around, I'm putting my hands in front of my face here in front of my camera. Okay. If you zoom your camera around in the middle, no one would probably even know you were moving the camera because it all looks like the same thing.
Uniformly the same color.
Absolutely. But as you near the edge, the white of the wall starts to peek in. Now, that white in this sense would represent nothingness because it's representing a blank canvas. So, and then if you move out, you'll start to get it bleeding in. But then if you move out all the way to the edge, you'll get these exotic flourishes, these like splash marks that are so unique and novel compared to the dense center. So those are the monsters at the edge of the map. That's where nothingness begins to creep into somethingness, or somethingness begins to creep into nothingness. And those manifest as monsters, right? Things that are terrifying. They're unknown, but they're also terrifying because it represents a sort of nothingness. At the edge of the map where you believe the world falls off, that's where the monstrous dwells. Borders, however, are different than the edge of the world. Borders within the whole. So let's say then you divided that up. You made a grid within the red paint. And let's say the paint landed a little bit differently here, and over time maybe some bubbles formed here. Maybe, a little bit of the wall began to peek through, whatever. There's variations in it. okay, and let's say it's more porous over here, it's bumpier over here, and there's lines dividing these. These are like states on a map, right? And there's different
Different textures, different
different
shapes.
terrains and
Yeah.
all of that. And you always know if you're traveling through one state, you know when you're getting close to another, right? So if I'm traveling to
Yeah.
Florida, before I get to Ohio from Michigan, I can tell Ohio is creeping into Michigan, right?
Yeah.
You know, in different places, there's in some parts of Ohio, it actually begins to get mountainous as you're moving into
Hmm.
Kentucky. It actually begins to get hilly, and you can feel Ohio haunting Michigan. You know,
Hmm.
and if you're coming from the other direction, you can sense it the same way. So it's at those borders where the known, which is the state you're traveling from, as you near that which you're going into, the one begins to bleed into the other, but it's not fully there yet. You're in between, you're in liminal space. And so that's one reason why I think hauntings appear at borders in our lives, when we're at a threshold, when we're at a point of change, because it's the place where distinctions begin to blur, but they also begin to appear, right? They're blurring if you're coming from one direction, but they're appearing if you're coming from another, right? So, distinction, there's distinction. And so, I mean, even just in terms of the lore of hauntings, like I said, oftentimes when a young woman is beginning to reach physical maturity, the age 13 is often used as an example. That's when people begin to say things begin to happen. Poltergeist activities, people claim, begin to happen around that age. When renovations are being done in homes, people claim it stirs up activities as well.
Absolutely
Yep.
true.
And why would that be? Well,
I
because
lived it.
yeah, you're between two worlds, right? You're you're in a limit. The old and the new are bleeding together, and so neither one feature is predominant, right? You're at a dusk, you're at a dawn. So both the darkness and light are present, and so that's when things appear. Because once you're all the way done with renovation, well, you're not in renovation anymore. And but before you're in renovation, you're not in renovation either. If you're smack dab in the middle of Michigan, you don't think to comment on Michigan. Or if you're smack dab in the middle of Ohio, you don't think to comment on Ohio. But when you're at the border, you're like, it's starting to look different here, right? The terrain is changing because you're at the border. And so,
Except for the 45th parallel.
well, and there's exceptions. Yeah.
That's the one exception in
Yeah.
Michigan. That's something you take note of when you cross it, because you're exactly halfway between the equator and the North Pole.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
very cool. I have
It
pictures
is.
of me standing in front of the sign, which
Yeah.
is really geeky, I know, but still.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's Michigan's exception.
Yeah. I know for sure. But that's an interesting, I think, phenomenon, right? That it's at the borders in our lives where spirits appear, whatever you want to call it. It's
Mhm.
where we experience the world as enchanted in some way. And it's because when you're fully in one season of your life, you don't think to comment on it because it's all that there is, right? And when you're in the previous season, you didn't think to comment on it because you were fully there. But it's when the two things begin to blend, that borders and distinctions appear, that you begin to feel that sense of haunting because something new is pressing into something old, and something old is bleeding into something new, and there you are. And so you experience the world as enchanted because distinctions appear. So when we think of non-dual consciousness, when we talk about all that kind of stuff, about oneness, about how we are all one and everything's one, I completely agree with that. However, that oneness, whatever we call it, God, whatever, source, if we want to be more generic, that one thing that all things have their being in chose to create borders, right?
Mhm.
Why? Because if all we are is swallowed up into the one, we don't experience the one.
Right. We
We
don't
only, yeah,
experience the distinctions,
mhm,
the minutia of
yeah,
magical moments in life.
exactly. You can't
It would all
experience
blend
unity.
together. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't appreciate unity if you haven't experienced fragmentation. You
Right.
know, and nor can you experience. It goes both ways. So that's why God, source, divine mind, whatever we want to call it, puts these borders up so that we have and our life is a journey in which we fall into seasons, and I don't mean fall in a negative way, but where we fall into seasons of sameness,
Mhm.
that we get tired of after a while. But what becomes same to us in one season was absolutely thrilling to us in another. Because when we crossed the border from a previous state into that state, it was thrilling. It was rocking our worlds and blowing our minds. But once we're in the center of it, we begin to get used to it. We don't think to comment on it anymore. We're not experiencing the enchantment anymore because we're not seeing distinction. And so distinction and unity are both important things. And I think separation is the thing that we mostly have crammed down our throats by religion.
Yeah.
Separation between us and the divine, separation between us and one another. And so that's kind of the thing we need to recover from at first. And so when we begin on a new journey, what we typically begin to discover is oneness. And that's absolutely beautiful. And we need to. But if you experience enough oneness, eventually the magic wears off because you cease to see the distinctions, right? And so that's why we go through seasons of liminality, so we can again see the beauty. I was just reading Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. I know we both love the book, but
Love
he's
it.
asked
I
he's
can
asked
quote
about
it.
marriage, right? He's asked about marriage, and
Mhm.
he says, I can't remember the exact wording. Maybe I'll pull it up and read it before the show's over because it's really beautiful. But he says, yeah, love each other, be united in oneness with one another, but let there be spaces between your oneness.
Mhm.
Drink, but don't drink from the same cup. In other words, marriage, yes, it is the blending of two souls into one, but you also have to keep the distinction between the two, or else what's going on? You're just in love with yourself, and part of the beauty of it is learning to love another person, learning to let another person's otherness change you, and your others change them, and that's how into oneness and into unity. So keep liminal space alive in your relationship, Gibran is saying, or the prophet is saying in the prophet, and that's how you keep the magic of it alive, by being intentional in creating liminal space. And I think in life it's the same thing. When we find ourselves in seasons of transition, seasons of change, we are being called to re-recognize the world, to recognize the world as being enchanted, right? We are being called to remember who we are, where we came from, where we are, because we forget when we're too long in the same place, even if it's a magical place.
Yeah,
Right?
and even on a rudimentary level,
Mm-hmm.
it calls us to think differently, to
Mm-hmm.
think more expansively.
Yeah.
And as I've said so many times, to begin, to open our third eye, to begin to open up parts of us that we have, kept protected and, safely hidden away.
Yeah.
And when we start to have that feeling of oneness,
Mm-hmm.
that starts falling away
Mm-hmm.
from us. But I guess and I think that's a good thing. But I mean, if you think about life as an intricate puzzle, a very intricate jigsaw puzzle,
Mm-hmm.
even after you have found every missing piece and put it in place, there's still a line between each and every piece where
Yes.
they interlock,
Yep.
but they don't completely touch.
Mm. Yeah. No, yeah, that's absolutely beautiful and absolutely correct. And that's why I think in our lives we have to be intentional. Sometimes if life is just if you're too long in the same place and you're bored, you have to force a liminal space. And that's why vacations are so magical. It's just, I mean, it's a simple thing, but literally that's one of the reasons why they're so magical, because you are creating an in-between space. On either sides of this there's life, but something, you literally come back recharged, and you're able to re-recognize your life for the beautiful thing that it is when you create that space. And that's
Yeah, and even your own thinking is refreshed.
Mhm,
Like
exactly.
hitting the easy button or the restart button.
And isn't it amazing? You don't really realize how stuck you become
Right.
oftentimes until you get that break. Even a single day off of the 9 to 5 or something. You take a day off in the middle of the week, or you take an extra day off, Monday or Friday, and you get a 3-day weekend instead of a 2-day weekend. You're like, holy smokes, I feel so much better because you broke things up, you created a liminal space, and now you're able to go back into life and remember why you do what you do, because life is beautiful and life is magical. And so, even the concept of mediumship, right? The medium is one who is aware of the spirit world more than others. Well, what is medium? Medium is the in between, small, medium, large, which this gives me an opportunity to tell my favorite dad that I tell, much to the chagrin of my children, all the time. I don't think it's gotten a laugh, maybe ever, but I tell it now because I love it. Have you heard about the vertically challenged spiritualist who recently escaped from the county jail? Yeah, the headline's read, "There's a small, medium, at large." Boom, rim shot. Anyways.
Precious.
That's my favorite joke. I'll take any opportunity I can tell to pull a dad joke out of my archives. I've always got a few in the chamber.
Excellent.
But even that concept, the medium is one who surfs the border, right? Mm-hmm. Surfs the border between the new and the old, and therefore they see both worlds at the same time. And there's a symbol in there that goes, people like that exist to teach us what's possible, right? People like that exist to teach us that we can live that way, and we can set up our lives in such a way. That's what prayer is. That's what meditation is. That's what, every time before we come on this show, I think actually tonight I didn't get to do it because I was running a little late, but I light a little incense. I have a little Palo Santo stick I usually light. I cross myself. I open myself up to wonder and reality in the presence of God, or whatever name we want to give it. And just that, it's just a space. It's a space in between, my normal day and this moment. And it opens me up and it puts me in a space where I'm ready, and little things like that, little rituals and practices like that in the mornings, in the evenings, in the middle of the day, whatever, that's the surfing of between the known and the unknown. And you can do it intentionally. But then there are moments where, against our will, they just happen. They just show up. Different seasons of life are like that. I mean, I'm 41. I know some still call that young, but for me, I feel the next half of life. I see the Ohio terrain creeping into my familiar Michigan, right? And it looks like maybe a few more gray hairs, and it feels like sitting there and just doing the weird dad moves you never understood as a kid. Like, why does my dad just stand at the window with his coffee cup in his hand, shaking his head? I don't know, but now I do it too. I feel the phenomenon of middle age beginning to manifest in my life. And I feel like I'm on that border between two halves of life. And it's odd, when I began to hit that space about 38, 39, where I kind of was feeling that halfway point, completely under my radar and against my will, a lot of supernatural manifestations just started happening, and things that hadn't happened in a long time. And it was I realized, I'm entering kind of the next half of my life, and it's always at the liminal that you encounter spirits. You always encounter ghosts at liminal space. I remember we did a show about earth angels a few months back, and you were talking about how you always have experiences at airports, right? And an airport's a liminal space, right? It's a literal liminal space. You're in between two destinations. So, of course, the angelic or whatever will manifest itself to you there. There's the story of Jacob in Genesis 32. It's one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament, where Jacob has lived a life of being a deceiver and just doing whatever he had to do to get ahead in life, so much so that he isolated himself from his brother and stole his birthright. And so he lived in fear of encountering his brother. And now he knows he's a day away from meeting his brother, and his brother's got a whole caravan of people with him. And so he's terrified that he's going to meet his end. And so it's here in this space in between an old life and a new life. It says a man or an angel wrestles with him at the ford of the Yabok River and wrestles with him till daybreak, And then as the day is breaking, this being says to him, "Let me go." As light is becoming predominant over darkness, this being says, "Let me go." And it probably goes back to it being some kind of, older like story about a river spirit and whatever. But still, that was left in is very important, because these things show up in liminal seasons. But Jacob says, "I won't let go of this experience until you bless me, until I get from this everything that I meant to get from it." And then once he does, he lets it go and he releases it. But I still find it interesting that it's there in that liminal space. He encounters this thing, and it changes him and it prepares him to enter into the next. And I think it's in The Magician's Nephew, C.S. Lewis, The Magician's Nephew, where they talk about the wood between worlds, right?
Yes.
It's essentially the portal between to all other. It's like the train station of the multiverse, I suppose you could say. And where there's these little pools that give you access to all the other worlds in the Narnian universe, but it's called the wood between worlds. And it's said that when there, you do get a little sleepy, and you shouldn't let yourself fall asleep there because you could get stuck there. So there's something to know about being in liminal space, that it's a season to kind of ride the wave and encounter what's there, but also
And stay alert.
Yes, exactly. Keep your wits about you.
Keep your wits about you. I've often thought about this, Jeff, in a slightly different way. You know how I mentioned, one of our lessons is to learn oneness and to begin to see our old reality with new eyes.
Yeah.
And a couple of years ago, and we knew each other, prior to that, but we met in person at the UFO Contact in Houghton Lake, Michigan. And I know that was a very important trip for you. And you had manifestations that occurred that weekend, including running into, of all people, your boss at, while we're sitting at the table, and you see him walking across the restaurant, and we were sitting at the table talking about doing a show together, and it turned out to be this show.
Yeah.
And all of that got and then the following week he left, and you got his job, and you also got your own show on KGRA. And that all happened at once, in the midst of all the magic and the marvelous promise of what occurred at the at Houghton Lake, at the Lakeside Resort, during that incredible event. And I don't know what it was, but it really was. It felt magical. It felt mystical. It felt, I spent the whole weekend being lost. I wasn't even in 3D. I was lost in a building that I know very well, over and over and over again. In fact, my dear friend and my assistant, Lenny, said she was going to get one of those squeegee wraps and put it on my wrist, like parents that have wayward children that have a tendency to wander off. Basically, it's a leash for humans.
Yeah.
And she said she was going to get one so that she could get me from point A to point B and not lose me in the hotel. It's because, and I'm comfortable in that space. I think I sent you the photograph that was a screenshot from the episode I did with the Ghost Brothers at the farm, where I was touching an entity at the head of the table, and this whole part of my body just became translucent. You could just look right through me. And you could even see that the candle lights were not in 3D anymore. There was like a bubble of activity, and there were figures in the doors, in both doors, one leaning in from behind me, one up on the chair looking into the room. There were crystalline light vessels that were flying around me. And that screenshot, in a way, that single screenshot of that moment when I touched the being at the end of the table and I entered its dimension, instead of it coming fully into mine. And that merging together for that moment got captured on film, and it changed a lot of people. I got hundreds of letters and comments about that single scene in that episode of Ghost Brothers. And it was because I think it was a moment of recognition that what we are saying is true, that you can be in that space, that is between one and the other, where you're not in 3D anymore, but you're partially in 5D. There might be a little intermingling of 4D or beyond, for all we know. But we're not in the same world. And yet we're in the same world, because our world is really a multi-dimensional microcosm of the universe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and that was a very significant weekend for me too, because to me it really represented the coming together of two halves of my life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I'm working on my next book right now, which is called The Sacred Yes. And in it, I'm kind of just telling my own story a little bit while weaving in some lessons and hopefully some insights. But I began as a very paranormally obsessed kid. You know, I was always obsessed with all things paranormal, whether it was UFOs, you know, aliens, ghosts, spirits, Bigfoot, or Jesus. You know, I was always, I was very, very much locked into it. I actually, in the little town I grew up in, I was there like last summer, and I actually wanted to go to the local library and check out and just see if they still had some of the ghost and UFO books I used to check out obsessively, and see if my name was still on the card and see how many times it was on there. Because I was always toting around, you know, those books from the 70s with the crazy color covers, you know, UFOs and all this stuff. I was always so into it. And as I became older and got more religious and more fundamentalist in my outlook on life, of course, all of that stuff had to go in my mind. You know, I felt I had to let all of that go because that doesn't belong in this world. And for years, I suppressed interest in it, you know, because I felt like it was demonic, because that's what I was told. I didn't know any better. That's what I was told, you know. And I lost you for a second. I don't know if I froze or if you froze. So I hope it came out what I said. Okay.
Yeah, I heard everything you said. I think everybody.
Okay. And you know, so I always had those interests, and then I felt like I had to let them go. And but it was always there. It was always under the surface. And I sort of supplemented it with, you know, obsessions with the spiritual experiences of famous Christian mystics and things like that. That sort of slaked that thirst and surfeited that hunger. You know, but there was still always that burning in me for the beyond to be in my midst, you know. And I remember after I lost my faith completely for a season and I became an atheist. Well, oddly enough, I was an atheist and I was still getting invited to preach at Christian conferences and things like that. And I was doing it. And so I spent a lot of weekends at hotels. And in those hotel rooms, I would always tend towards the Travel Channel. And I would watch the paranormal documentaries and all those kinds of things. And, you know, some of them are better than others. But still, it just took me back to my childhood. It took me back to those moments of obsession with these sorts of things, especially because I lived in a house for 13 years where we had manifestations like, you know, shadow figures appearing in front of 4 different people, you know, winds coming in through windows, knocking people against walls. I mean, we experienced this constantly for almost 13 years. So it was in my mind that this is real, and it isn't all just as simple as, you know, the very cramped Christian narrative that I was handed. Come to find out, it's actually not a very cramped narrative at all, but the one I was handed was. And so I had gone through, there was a revival and interest in all these things. And as I was coming back into a faith, something like faith, I was really struggling with how to unite these ideas, you know, how to unite these things. And actually, it was I had already come up with the kind of like philosophy of how they are united, but it was actually at the conference itself that they came together, you know. And it really it was a very powerful coming together of these two worlds for me, and it transformed me. You know, it was my moment of coincidentia positorum, where the two opposites became one. And that's why I always talk about that, because I always come to points like that in my life where two things that seem irreconcilable merge into oneness, and oh wow. And then there's that moment of satori, there's that moment of blessed, like, just I'm there, you know. And then there comes another moment of tension, liminality, and then you experience the oneness again, and that's how life is. But that was such a fantastic experience, because it was a very liminal experience for me.
Mhm.
I was not uncomfortable with the subject matter, not uncomfortable with a single thing, not at all. But I was uncomfortable being there, being who I was, right? Because every other place I've ever spoken at has been a Christian conference of some kind, and I was even just like, do I belong here? You know what I mean? I was
Mhm.
like, I don't know if I've got anything to say to this. I was like, I did. Obviously, I worked on my talk and I read about this stuff. I had things in my head to say, but like, I felt very out of place. By the time I left, I felt fully wrapped up in this thing.
Yeah.
Like I felt completely embraced, and it really now I'm a transformed person because of it. Because that's what happens when things we think opposite come together. There's a transformation. That's what the alchemical term coincidentia oppositorum means. The coming together of seemingly opposing forces, and something new emerges as a result. The Star of David, the hexagram we've been talking about the last couple weeks,
Mhm.
one points up, one points down. They come together. It's a whole different shape. It's a whole different thing now. Um, Things that are literally opposite, a whole new thing arises. So yeah, no, that was a very significant event for me, and it was laden with symbolism. There were synchronicities everywhere. So many things led up to it. It was just so bizarre. And like you said, even when I was there, the fact that there were these convergences of worlds that there's no logical reason why they converged. Like my boss walking past me right as we're talking, and then in a matter of weeks afterwards, it lined up. I have to look at my journal to remember how the numbers lined up now, because there's too much that goes on in this head sometimes.
Yeah.
But it lined up perfectly with something else that happened there, and I can't remember exactly the details. That's why I have to write things down. But it was just so serendipitous. It was so like it just blew my mind, and it's changed my life. And I feel, because for a long time I was really searching for, who am I now? You
Yeah.
know, post pastoring, having dimension, having atheist, and now returning to a more mystical form of Christianity that is open, in a sort of perennial fashion, more of a syncretistic way to a lot of other things. What do I do now? I really was struggling with that. And that moment solidified for me what had been forming in me all throughout COVID, where,
Mm.
because during that season, it was a liminal season, right? That whole season, because it was
For
an in
all of
between
us.
for all of us. And it forced change in a lot of us because,
Yeah.
well, it was a transformative season. And so there was a lot of potential floating around me during that season, because I'd realized, well, I'm not speaking anywhere on Sunday. So my mind can be fixed on other things. I can explore other ideas, because I don't have to just be focused on one thing, because I'm prepping to talk for the weekend. And
Well,
that, anyways, yeah, it all just kind of pulled together in that moment. And so
also remember us talking about um, how during COVID, how many people
yep,
were having supernatural experiences.
yeah, yep,
And, we tried to logically, does it follow logically that people are seeing more in the sky because they're free to be outside looking up?
mm,
Are they having more experiences in their homes because they're actually home to experience it? What is the causal connection,
mhm,
that there would be a heightened activity of
right.
loved ones checking in from the other side, of people saying, oh my God, what was that? Maybe for the first time in their lives, and knowing in their gut
Mhm.
that they were seeing something that was not manufactured on this planet.
Right.
And those numbers went through the roof
Mhm.
during, I would say, about an 18-month period where the reports skyrocketed, no pun intended. And people were having numerous experiences in
Mhm.
their homes, particularly.
Yep.
And you have to wonder, is it just because they were there, or they were free to go walk in the woods, or, take their shoes off and let the grass tickle their toes? It was this, they were having this new middle space experience, and so much else opened up to them
Yep.
during that period of time.
Yep.
And for the last couple of years, when I have been at different events, I have had people approach me and tell me that as terrible as the pandemic was, and now it's endemic, and so it's just here now. But at its height, and for the 6 to 8 months that it was ravaging our population, people were all uniformly dealing with the concept of their own mortality, losing loved ones, friends and loved ones, family members. That changes a person.
Yes.
And, this I speak from experience. It changes a person. And it seems to me that it's in those liminal periods that we're at our bravest and our most fierce, and we're also at our most vulnerable.
Hmm. Yep.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And you know, for example, I mean, look at the story of the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is meant to represent a liminal space because you have the Garden of Eden is actually supposed to be a mountain. That's actually the picture that's given because the rivers flowed down. So it's supposed to be a mountain. And then God comes down, meets with them there. They can go down. So it's a point in between. And the Jewish temple was actually thought to be the same thing. That's why it says, Heaven is my throne, as the earth is my footstool. The
Mhm.
footstool was thought to be the temple. That's where the two worlds met. The symbolism
And
in,
the symbolism also applies in the liturgy of the Vatican.
yeah, absolutely. Yep. And so the two worlds were seen as being connected, but they were there in the middle of it. And what was their primary feature? Nakedness. And the word nakedness refers to vulnerability. That's
Mhm.
really what the word means. And actually, it says the serpent. This is interesting. The serpent, the word in Hebrew for naked, is the same word basically it's used when it said that the serpent was the most cunning or shrewd animal in the garden. So right after it says they were naked in each other's presence and felt no shame, but then it says the serpent was more cunning. The two words in Hebrew, naked and cunning, are the same. So they were vulnerable, you know, in their nakedness, and the serpent was also vulnerable, but had become aware of its vulnerability to the point where it knew that it could use it to manipulate, right? And the whole story is really them becoming aware of their vulnerability, right? And
Mhm.
that's why after they realize they're naked, they try to cover it up with leaves because they're trying to like put a border and a barrier between them
Yes,
and the world.
but that's also the loss of innocence that I believe
Yep.
is symbolized in
Oh,
that as well.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think realizing how vulnerable you are is a part of a loss of innocence. You know, I mean, a
Yeah.
victim of abuse learns that very quickly. You know,
Yep.
you realize, wow, something I never knew about myself is that apparently there are people who prey on this. You know, you realize your vulnerability and then literally you'll hide yourself, you know, and that's part of the story. You're very vulnerable in that space and you do have to guard yourself. You have to be on guard. That's one of the reasons you got to keep your wits about you in liminal space because there's both dangers, but then there's also all sorts of things in liminal space that can pull you on to the next phase of your life. So you have to keep your wits about you in liminal space because you're going to be encountering the best and the worst in amplified ways. You know,
Yes.
so there's pitfalls and perils, but there's also blessings aplenty as well, and you have to be attuned to both of them. And I think liminal space also teaches us. It teaches us to not be naive because we do realize the world isn't just one way, you know.
Mhm.
And I think when we get too settled in one land, you can either think it's all bad or you can think it's all good, but the truth lies at the border.
Mhm.
It's both, and you got to keep your wits about you concerning both. And if you
Mhm.
can love the world at the border, you've learned to love, right? Because if I just love it here or I just loathe it here, but if I can love it at the border, that's I've learned to love, you know.
Yeah, it's really a shame that if I wrote my autobiography, I would want to title it Gullible's Travels. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, that title has been taken.
I was gonna say that's a fantastic title.
It's a
Mm,
fantastic book,
mm,
too. Yeah, people should look that up, especially women should look
mm.
that up. It's very revealing in many ways.
Mm.
about our flaws and foibles and what we tolerate as women.
Mm.
But anyway, again, my darling, we have blown through an hour, and that mean
I see it.
producer
Mm.
just sent me a notification that he gave us 5 minutes, and that was like 4 minutes ago.
Mm.
Oh, he's just so, we're so good, and we, seem to gravitate toward this evil entity that runs our lives according to a clock.
Yep. Yep.
Um, and yet he's so adorable that we keep him. It's like
Yeah. It's why we
he's,
serve him. Yep.
I know we serve the master. We
Yep.
do.
Yep.
And he is, Bill, we love you. We love you. And thank you, Bill,
Mhm.
for building this show for us, because he did this.
Yeah.
He put this together for us. I remember the day that we sat and we worked on putting the opening together, and that picture behind us with the beautiful aurora borealis and the solitary figure at the side of the ocean.
Mm.
And I was like, I have this picture. I really, really love it. What can we do
Mm.
with it? Boom, done.
Mhm.
He's brilliant. He's wonderful. And he makes our job here every Friday night very easy.
Yep. All I got to do is turn the computer on. He does everything
I
else.
know.
Yep.
Click, done.
Yep.
He's got it. Oh,
Mm.
God. So, but anyway, I adore you. I adore you. You know it. Thank you for the massively inspiring text message upon which we built this show tonight.
Mhm.
And, keep those cards and letters coming, folks. I mean, if what we're doing in any way helps you, change the way you think or expand your own, helps you through your spiritual evolution, we're very, very happy and honored to be a part of that.
Yes.
So,
Absolutely.
that said, my darling, we'll see you again next Friday night. I'll talk to you over the weekend. And
Right.
for everybody that's here with us tonight, uh, be the light you seek.
Yes.
Class dismissed.